on this episode of Therapy Bites Art Lab.
Oh, excuse me. Wait, are you yawning now too? What actually is happening when we yawn after someone else yawns, or when we feel that deep sadness when we see those puppies and kittens for those only 10 cent a day commercials for the ASPCA? Join us today as we talk about the psychology of empathy.
Welcome to Therapy Bites Art Lab, where Dr. Heath and his special guests share real-life stories of helping and healing, fresh from the actual therapy couch, while taking a bite out of common counseling missteps and misconceptions. And now, here's Heath and the TBAL Team.
Hey everybody, so as you heard in the intro today, we are going to be talking about empathy and mirror neurons and how those two things come together. So we'll be covering a lot of different aspects of empathy, maybe answering some questions that people have had about empathy, and even the difference between empathy and sympathy. So when you think of empathy, what comes to mind?
I hear people when they talk about empathy, they talk about walking in someone else's shoes.
Yeah, my dad had a saying. He said, never criticize somebody until you've walked a mile in their shoes. That's a popular saying. And my dad put a twist on it, and I think he probably heard this from somewhere. He said, I once complained I had no shoes until I met a man who had no feet.
Oh, wow.
And that had a huge impact on me as a kid. And the reason it had an impact is because I had a very vivid imagination as a kid. And I immediately began to imagine, I mean, as terrible as this sounds, walking around on stumps instead of feet. And it really taught me a lesson about complaining. And there are things I don't like, but I tend not to be a complainer. I don't complain about the structural problems with my back. I don't complain about the problems with my hips. A lot of degenerative stuff going on there. I don't complain. I just find that it really makes it worse for me. So and that all came from empathy with someone that I didn't even know. And of course, specifically didn't exist. It's an old saying that my dad came up with somewhere. And so the thing about empathy we'll talk about in a few moments, the whole neuroscience behind empathy is what created that in my brain and why even today it affects me thinking back on it.
And with sympathy and empathy, see what you guys think. I've heard it said that with empathy, like let's say somebody's in a hole, somebody's stuck down in a hole. Sympathy jumps down in the hole and sits with them down there. Empathy throws a rope down and tries to help them out. What do you think?
Gosh, I love that. I think that's fantastic. I was thinking something a little bit different, and I think that all these can kind of tie together. Sympathy is when I look at you and I'm really, really sorry that you're having this experience, and I'm here to do what I can to help you with that experience. And certainly as clinicians, you know how this is with patients and when you're doing coaching with coaching clients. Whereas empathy is I am really creating in my brain a Hollywood version of your experience as if it's happening to me. And I see the problem in the profession is that one or the other gets demonized, and it's usually sympathy. Right. That, in this profession, you don't want sympathy, you want empathy. But what about this? What about if they're both tools and we need to use the proper tool to the proper extent, in the proper situation, with a proper frequency? It's just two different tools in our toolkit of clinicians, and so I use both. I really don't create in my mind, nor could I, the experience of another person, so I can do therapy even though I've not been through your specific situation. And I can have sympathy for that because there is no video in my head, other as a suffering human on a journey that really replicates your experience. But I can still have sympathy for that. And I think that's helpful in connecting, but also it's not actually, and we'll talk about what maybe if we have time, what good sympathy or empathy actually does with the mechanics of therapy, because we do therapy based on cognitive science. And I think there's a utility for that. But I can still show you the way, the path, a map, techniques. For instance, if your house is on fire, do I need to have sympathy or empathy to teach you how to use the fire extinguisher? I don't think that I do. I can just show you how to do that. But there may be a reason for using either of those, both of those in different contexts, maybe after the fire, or maybe while you're struggling to use that fire extinguisher on the blaze. So they're both tools and they're both necessary, if not essential, I think, for good clinical therapy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. And something else that can slightly be demonized sometimes too is when you're providing therapy is self-disclosure. But I think if it's a situation where you think it's actually going to be helpful to the person themselves, that's where that kind of empathy, here I've been through something kind of similar, now oh, they kind of get it. They've been through something similar, so I've found that whenever I've used that in working with patients, and I use it limited and sparingly, is that they've been like, oh my goodness, you get it, you've been there. And they it helps the rapport, and they tend to open up a little bit more and want to talk more about, hey, is this normal? Is that normal? Is this an abnormal experience? All that kind of stuff. I don't know if that's been y'all's experience or not.
Well, and I do. I love that. As you're talking about that, Sarah, I'm thinking that what that does is we seek to connect to the patient from our side of the equation, and self-disclosure, if the patient's ready for it, helps them activate centers in their brain to connect back to us if they're ready for it, if they have fuel for the journey. But I want to take it in a little bit different direction, a different angle, is how people in relationships, husbands, in my case, can use both sympathy and empathy, and how wives can use that with their husbands, and how parents can use that with their children.
The TherapyBites podcast is HIPAA compliant. No identifying patient information will be disclosed by TherapyBites podcast hosts or TherapyBites podcast guests without permission from patients or guardians. All personal stories are de-identified in order to comply with HIPAA, the NASW Code of Ethics, and the ethical principles of psychologists and Code of Conduct. Fresh from the therapy couch and from the deep dark recesses, stories may involve exploding preconceived notions and topics uncomfortable to underthinkers and small farm animals. Audience discretion and duct taping your head for safety is advised. Concrete-headed Kool-Aid drinking humans assume all risks associated with any possibility of choking to death on the accurate, realistic thoughts presented in the art lab. This is natural selection, and TherapyBites podcast management and hosts are not responsible.
I had a patient years ago that said this to me: we just can't argue. What was going on? They were catastrophizing the normal messiness of human communication. And when we do that, we ignite a catastrophe response in the brain that teaches us that one person is a grizzly bear fighting with another grizzly bear. Stop catastrophizing and start embracing the real life messiness of communication. Communication is meant to be messy, much like plowing a field is naturally messy, or cultivating before planting a crop is naturally messy. Instead of catastrophizing it, realize the value in it, that the more difficult time we have of communicating, the more deeply we can cultivate a relationship. Now back to today's episode.
You're listening to Therapy Bites Art Lab, bite-sized therapy for your brain with Dr. Heath and the TBAL Team. The best advice on the net. No copay required.
For full show notes and transcript of today's episode, go to therapybites.podbean.com.
Here's Heath and the TBAL Team.
And I'll start off with the children thing, and I think the biggest thing is training it, because I think that empathy is trainable and can be trainable. Now, I know there's some therapists out there that say you can't do that, but it's a skill. It is a trainable skill, and it requires those 3 golden nuggets that we often talk about: practice, practice, and more practice. 1, 2, 3, practice, practice, practice. And I think it should be trained. As a matter of fact, in my work in studying psychopathy, that's the one thing that I find absent, is that you might have a cold, detached mother, so there's no empathy, maybe some sympathy. Oh, I'm sorry you have a boo-boo. But they may be wrapped up in their own stuff and the lack of health in that primary relationship with their spouse, and there may be a father with alcoholism, and so that anesthetizes their ability to connect through sympathy or empathy. And then there's nothing for the child to replicate. We learn by watching. We learn by hearing. We put together that visual training and audio training, and if it's not absent, it's just a skill we don't learn. Imagine, it'd be like asking, why doesn't my child speak French? Well, gosh, I don't know. Did you ever speak French in your home? Well, there you go. There's the reason. Why don't I have an empathetic child? I don't know. Did you ever speak the language of empathy in your home? And I'm not talking about running and snatching the kid up every time they have a boo-boo. I do think there can be empathy that is out of control, where the parent is not responding to meet the needs of the child. They're simply responding to meet their own needs and projecting their earlier experiences onto the child. And you might even call it, reparenting themselves or something. And that doesn't meet the child's needs. And I think that breeds, children that are less resilient if we run in a mad dash to solve, resolve, doctor every single boo-boo. But we learn empathy. We learn it, early on. What do you guys think about in your own relationships, using or deploying, if we talk in tactical terms, deploying both sympathy and empathy?
I think it's an important part of the communication process. So we always have a choice. So let's say my husband comes home and he's had a very difficult day and his boss has been challenging. Now, I could go into all of the things, well, if you thought about it this way, or if you chose to do it a different way, or maybe if you talk to him like this, I could explain away, but that would do nothing to really help him. And he'd probably be more frustrated. But if instead I listen to what he has to say and I'm like, oh my goodness, that is really challenging. And I try to ask him, is this something that you want advice on? Or is this a situation where you just want to vent and you just want me to listen to what you have to say? And then I can express either that sympathy, or if I've been in a similar situation, that empathy. And it seems to have a better result, and it brings us closer together, because I've noticed also the longer we've been together, he does more of that as well. So, it's kind of one of those things where we're leading by example, not only with our children, but with all of our relationships. And also it brings more connection, I think, is what I've noticed.
And you guys, you hear that? A key thing I'll point out there that Sarah mentioned is actually asking the other person what they need from you in that moment, instead of assuming that whatever tool you decide to use is the tool needed for the job. In a relationship, it is the other person which shares with you the best tool to use. It's almost like if you were on the table getting, some type of cardiothoracic surgery, being able to tell the surgeon, hey, use this or use that. But, we husbands, we don't want to do that. We want to jump in and deploy the sympathy thing. Oh, yeah, that's, and I'm not downplaying this, because when my wife is suffering, I truly have sympathy for that. But it really depends on, does she believe that this is a problem to be solved or a connection to be made? So if she wants a 3-step solution, well, that's going to be sympathy and solution. If she needs to make a connection to try to heal through the conduit of our relationship, then that's empathy. And I'm going to join with her in that experience. But empathy takes a lot more energy than sympathy. So if you need to put the fire out, you need the energy to put the fire out, and empathy comes later. So sympathy first in crisis. Empathy, and you clinicians, it's the same thing. If a patient comes during crisis, some clinicians, all they know is empathy. Well, that's like if the only tool you got's a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Or I guess maybe if the only tool you have is a buffer, then every problem looks like a scratch on the automobile. Yeah, we'll just buff it right out of there, by some type of, wax on, wax off vigorous massage or something. But a patient in crisis has sympathy and solve the problem. What to do next? And a psychological bankrupt's not going to do that. I feel for you. I'm sorry you're going through that. Let's talk about the next step now. And some clinicians, they just don't know how to do that, and there's lots of problems in life that a therapist, although you should be careful with your hugs in this day and age, but there's so many problems in life that you just can't hug away. And I see a lot of patients that's all they've ever gotten in therapy is this big psychological hug. And what do they leave with? Well, they leave with their problems and less money, because they give their money to the therapist that doesn't solve a problem, because all they know how to do is provide some type of, mental health hug that they've practiced on camera. And yes, we do practice on camera, or when I was in school, we did. In undergrad, I started practicing on camera in undergrad. And so, again, it really asks the customer and collaborate with them to assess what they need. And the customer may be your child, and the customer may be your spouse. If you're a clinician, the customer may be your client or your patient.
Yeah. And I think a key question to ask, not even necessarily if you're a clinician, not necessarily of your patient, but of yourself, is what's going to be the most beneficial for this patient going forward, not what's going to be the most comfortable for me, because it can be quite uncomfortable to have a patient who's going through something difficult, but to have to redirect them to, okay, well, what do you have control over? When they're used to just having somebody say, oh, I'm so sorry, and we both sit in sadness together, but that's not going to benefit the situation. I've had patients leave sessions and they've been quite upset. And then when they come back, and they do come back, it's amazing. When they come back, they're like, you know what, I really thought about what you said after I'd calmed down, and I was like, dang it, she's right. So it's kind of one of those things where you don't think about, well, what's the most comfortable for me in the moment? What's the most beneficial to the other person in the moment?
Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of clinicians do that, because they get very good at empathy, but then they get very comfortable with it. Comfortable. Sorry to make that into a 2-syllable word from Arkansas, comfortable. They get very comfortable with that, but that's all they know how to do, because they don't practice anything that is solution-based. Okay, but what I do next? Hey guys, we think this is a big topic, an important topic, and we really want to give it the time, space, and attention that it needs. So tune back in next week, but also week after next will be part 2 of this very important episode on empathy and using it to encourage relationship health in your life.
Bye.
Bye guys, catch you next time.
Hey T-Ballers, thanks so much for being with us today. If we brought value to your day, show us some love by leaving your positive feedback and inviting some friends to listen in, and join the T-Ball Team.